Thousands of years ago, a brutal population crash nearly wiped them out completely. Then ancient DNA told the strangest survival story ever. What if the classic image of the blonde, pure-blooded Viking is a total genetic lie? Scientists studying old bones just found out something shocking. Some of the most feared Viking warriors buried with full honors had absolutely zero Scandinavian DNA. But that's not even the strangest part. Deep in the Nordic gene pool lies the ghost of a catastrophic population bottleneck, so severe it almost wiped them out completely. Today we are breaking down the dark, ancient, and genetically bizarre truth of Nordic DNA that history textbooks are terrified to touch. From Ice Age hunters who followed retreating glaciers into a frozen wasteland, to seafaring raiders who reshaped the genetic map of Europe, DNA evidence revealing a population history stranger than the sagas themselves. We're about to uncover the real story of the Nordic people. This isn't about horned helmets in IKEA. This is about survival in one of the harshest environments on the planet, and the ancient bloodlines that turned isolation into power. The origins of the Nordic people are hiding in plain sight, buried under centuries of myth, nationalism, and pop culture. So, who actually are these people? And where did they really come from? Before we get into bloodlines, we need to understand the land itself. Because in the north, geography decided everything. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland. 5 countries, roughly 27 million people, sitting at the very edge of habitable Europe. For most of human history, this was about as far from civilization as you could get and still survive. Brutal winters, short growing seasons, mountains, fjords, and forests that isolated communities from each other for generations. That isolation matters more than people realize. When a population gets cut off in small pockets for centuries, strange things start happening to its gene pool. Genetic traits that would get diluted in a larger, more connected population instead get locked in and passed down with unusual consistency. The Nordic countries are practically a laboratory for this kind of effect, and scientists have been picking apart exactly how it happened. Here's something that surprises most people. Despite sharing similar languages, similar cultures, and a similar Viking-era history, Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and Finns are not nearly as genetically uniform as you'd assume. In fact, one of these groups is so genetically different from its neighbors that geneticists first struggled to explain it. And that mystery is where this story needs to start. Listen to Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish side by side, and you'll notice something. They're practically the same language wearing different accents. Language scientists actually call them a dialect continuum, meaning speakers can often understand each other without ever learning the other language. That's because all three come down from Old Norse, the language carried across the seas by the Vikings themselves. Now listen to Finnish. It sounds nothing like its neighbors because it isn't related to them at all. Finnish belongs to a completely different language family, the Uralic family, related distantly to Estonian and Hungarian. Finland sits right in the middle of Scandinavia, surrounded by Germanic-speaking neighbors, and somehow kept a language that arrived from an entirely different direction thousands of years earlier. This isn't just a language curiosity. It's a giant flashing sign pointing to a genetic story that doesn't match the simple Nordic people are all Vikings story most people carry around. If the language split this dramatically, what does that say about the ancestry underneath it? That question is about to get a lot stranger once we go back to who actually arrived here first. To understand the genetics, you have to go back further than the Vikings, back to the end of the last ice age. As the glaciers retreated 11,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers began pushing north, following herds of reindeer into newly exposed land. These weren't one group moving in one direction. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows at least 2 separate migration routes. One moving up through what's now Denmark and southern Sweden, and another sweeping in from the east along the Arctic coastline, possibly starting from populations much further towards Siberia. These early populations were few, scattered, and constantly battling a landscape that wanted them dead. Then around 4,000 years ago, everything changed again. A massive wave of migration swept up from the Pontic steppe, the same Yamna-related population that reshaped genetics across much of Europe. They brought new technology, new burial customs, and a new genetic signature that would come to dominate much of the Nordic gene pool. By the time you reach the Viking Age, starting around 800 AD, you're not looking at one unified population at all. You're looking at the descendants of Ice Age hunters, steppe migrants, and waves of farmers, all layered on top of each other across a few thousand years, scattered into isolated valleys and fjords that barely talk to one another. And that splitting up is exactly what historians and geneticists have spent decades arguing about. Here's where this stops being a tidy story and starts getting contentious. For over a century, the idea of a pure, unified Nordic race got hijacked by some of the ugliest ideologies in modern history. 19th and early 20th century race scientists obsessed over blonde hair and blue eyes, treating Scandinavians as some kind of genetically untouched master population. That framework collapsed under its own weight, scientifically and morally. But the myth of Nordic genetic purity never fully disappeared from popular imagination. The real historical argument among researchers has been different. Some scholars argued the Viking Age represented a unified Scandinavian expansion outward. Raiders and traders carrying a shared Norse identity to Britain, Iceland, and beyond. Others pushed back, arguing the Viking world was actually a patchwork of competing, genetically distinct regional groups who happened to share a language and a few cultural habits, not a cohesive ethnic group at all. Then there's Finland, sitting awkwardly outside this whole debate. Was Finland's population always genetically separate from its neighbors, or did something specific happen that pushed it toward isolation? For decades, nobody could answer that with confidence. Old chronicles and place names could only go so far. What finally broke the argument open wasn't a historian. It was a geneticist with access to ancient bones. Ancient DNA research over the past decade has completely rewritten the Nordic origin story. And some of the findings are startling even by the standards of this field. Studies coming out of institutions including the University of Copenhagen's Esk Willerslev Lab and the Max Planck Institute have decoded the DNA of hundreds of ancient Scandinavian skeletons spanning thousands of years. One of the most significant findings involves Finland. Genetic analysis shows that Finnish populations experienced a severe population bottleneck within the last few thousand years. A dramatic reduction in genetic diversity, likely caused by a small founding population expanding into a sparse landscape. That bottleneck is why Finnish genetics looks so different from its neighbors today, despite sitting right in the middle of Scandinavia. Then there's the Viking Age itself. A landmark study published in Nature decoded ancient genomes from Viking-era burial sites across Scandinavia and the regions Vikings raided and settled. The results overturned the image of Vikings as a genetically uniform group of blonde raiders. Some individuals buried with full Viking ceremonial honors in Scotland and other raided territories turned out to have no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Local people had adopted Viking identity, culture, and burial customs without any of the bloodline. Even more striking, the study found that Viking-era Scandinavia itself had far more genetic diversity, flowing in from southern and eastern Europe than anyone expected. The Vikings weren't a closed genetic club expanding outward. They were already a mixed population before they ever stepped into a long ship. And the steppe ancestry from thousands of years earlier never went away. It's still detectable in the modern Nordic gene pool, sitting underneath every later wave of migration like bedrock. This is where the science crashes head-on with culture, and it hasn't gone smoothly. For some people, the idea that Vikings weren't a genetically pure Scandinavian bloodline feels like an attack on national identity. Nordic countries have spent the last century building cultural pride around Viking heritage, museums, festivals, even tourism campaigns, leaning hard into the warrior ancestor narrative. Discovering that some Vikings were locally recruited converts with zero Scandinavian DNA complicates that story. On the other side, the discovery of Finland's genetic bottleneck has occasionally been misused, too, sometimes framed in online spaces as evidence of some kind of separateness or even inferiority. Language echoing exactly the kind of pseudoscience that plagued this field a century ago. Geneticists studying this material have been very clear in pushing back against that interpretation, pointing out repeatedly that a population bottleneck is a statistical event caused by founder effects and isolation, not a marker of anything resembling purity or distinctiveness in the way nationalist narratives want it to mean. What's genuinely fascinating is how the genetic findings cut against almost every simplified version of Nordic identity people have built. The blonde, blue-eyed Viking stereotype turns out to be only part of a much messier, more diverse genetic reality, stretching back to hunter-gatherers, steppe nomads, and ways of contact with the rest of Europe that never stop happening, even during the isolated Viking Age. When scientists looked under the hood of Nordic DNA, they found a massive genetic signature from a mysterious ghost population called ancient North Eurasians. And here's where it gets truly wild. This identical ghost DNA is the exact genetic bridge shared between modern Scandinavians and Native Americans. Thousands of years before the Vikings sailed to Newfoundland, a deep prehistoric bloodline already linked the icy steppes of Scandinavia to the Americas. Survival in the freezing north forced human DNA to literally change in real time. To survive months of near-total darkness, Nordic bodies stripped away melanin, mutating into ultra-pale skin and blue eyes just to soak up every single drop of UV light. At the exact same time, a brutal famine forced a genetic mutation that allowed adults to digest animal milk without getting sick. What we call Nordic traits today aren't badges of a master race. They are the literal scars of evolutionary desperation. If you walked into a Scandinavian valley 10,000 years ago, the people looking back at you would break your brain. They didn't look like modern Swedes. Genetic mapping shows these early pioneers were a striking mix. Many had dark, deeply tanned skin paired with piercing, bright blue eyes. It was a genetic combination that practically doesn't exist on Earth today. Where did this sudden burst of European DNA in the Viking Age come from? The answer is incredibly grim. It was the slave trade. The Vikings didn't just bring back gold. They brought back thousands of captive women from Ireland and Scotland. If you look at modern Iceland today, the DNA tells a haunting story. Almost all the founding fathers were Norse raiders, but the majority of the founding mothers were Celtic captives. So, where does all of this leave the Nordic origin story? The honest picture looks like this. Nordic populations descend from at least two separate waves of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, reshaped dramatically by steppe migrations roughly 4,000 years ago, then further diversified by genetic contact that continued throughout the Viking Age, even as Viking culture and identity spread outward through conquest, trade, and in some cases, simple cultural adoption by people with no Scandinavian blood at all. Finland's distinct genetic profile isn't separateness for its own sake. It's the visible signature of a population bottleneck, a specific demographic event layered on top of the same deep ancestry shared with its neighbors. This isn't a story about purity. It never was. It's a story about isolation creating distinctiveness in some places while constant contact and mixing created surprising diversity in others, often within the same culture. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with longest. The Viking Age, the era most associated with a single fierce, unified Nordic identity, turns out to be one of the most genetically mixed periods in the region's entire history. The raiders weren't defending a pure bloodline. They were already living proof that identity and ancestry had stopped being the same thing long before anyone wrote it down. What survived wasn't a pure Nordic gene pool. It was an adaptable population that absorbed outsiders just as easily as it raided them. So, what surprised you the most? The idea that some Vikings had no Scandinavian DNA at all? The hidden population bottleneck behind Finland's genetic story? Or the steppe ancestry sitting quietly underneath everything we associate with the Viking Age? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more videos digging up the hidden genetic history behind the cultures you thought you already understood, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started.